Continuing here on the Exam Room podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee, and I want to pose a question to you. What do people who are severely overweight have in common with people who are severely underweight? Well, as you see on the screen is Dr. Andrew Freeman. He is the Director of Cardiovascular Prevention and Wellness at National Jewish Health, and he has the answer to this very question, and it is a very surprising answer at that. Dr. Freeman, welcome to the Exam Room.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here and really love what you and the Physicians Committee are doing.
When I first caught wind of this editorial that you wrote not too long ago that was published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, I was shocked because when you think about malnutrition, you think that somebody who doesn't have a whole lot to eat, I should say. You think about people who may be suffering from bulimia or anorexia. You think about malnutrition, you don't think about the person who's 300 or 400 pounds, but nonetheless, even though you've got 300 pounds difference between these two individuals, they have a lot in common here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a lot of linked concepts to unpack in this. But the truth is, malnutrition indices are based on a number of sort of abstract things like white blood cell counts and other things as markers of what your body is capable of doing. And so I was one of the editorial comments on a paper that showed that significant malnutrition exists in obese people, and we always joke, you see someone who weighs 300, 400, 500 pounds or more, and we're like, oh, malnourished over there, right? But the truth is they may actually be malnourished. And when you're eating a lot of processed junk, it's not hard to really gain a lot of fat and very little in terms of nutrients that are important, including vitamins, potassium, things you find in fruits and vegetables. I always tell my own patients that, the longer the shelf life, the shorter your life. And you may have seen these very interesting classifications for foods these days, what's called ultra-processed foods. And ultra-processed foods are things like, ramen noodles, right? The things that we paid 26 cents for in college. And, that 26 cents, of course, wreaked enormous amounts of havoc on us later in life, to the tunes of thousands of dollars worth of damage. But nonetheless, that kind of stuff is so readily available now that's what people are eating.
Absolutely. And just to kind of paint the picture of how prevalent this is the statement that really stood out to me. And I quote here, the World Health Organization states that worldwide there are almost 2 billion people who are overweight or obese and 462 million who are underweight. And I quote now, all of whom are considered malnourished. So again, I think back to when I was overweight, famously ate that 10,000 plus calorie a day diet. It seems to me like even though I'm eating a 10,000 calories worth of junk food, just because of the volume of that, you would think that I would be getting everything that I need, but that's not even close to being the case.
Yeah, it's surprising. You'd think that if you're eating a lot of calories that you're getting all the nutrients you need. I always joke, one of the things that you probably hear all the time is, if you're plant-based, where do you get your protein, right? And the truth is, in order to be protein deficient, especially in the United States, you have to be calorie deficient. So believe it or not, even in those obese people, the protein deficiency is exceedingly rare and usually not present at all. But you'd be surprised that a lot of these foods, because they're not fresh fruits or vegetables, have been stripped of many of their necessary macro and micronutrients like potassium, calcium, even vitamin D is usually stripped away. So it's very interesting to just see this. I would tell you that in my entire career, I've actually never treated protein deficiency in the United States. I did spend a month in Kenya. And when you saw calorie deficiency, you did see protein deficiency. You might remember those videos and commercials from the 1980s when people had, what's called kwashiorkor, those very swollen bellies because they were so malnourished. And here we are in a different, sort of overall place in the world. It's interesting. I don't know if you read The Week magazine, but I love it because it summarizes the world's sort of story every week in just a few pages. And in 2012, they published a really great headline, which showed that there is more health issue from people being overweight than for being underweight and completely malnourished for the first time ever in world history. And that
Mm,
was in 2012.
mm.
So, we are in a really sad state right now, unfortunately.
Have you or any of your colleagues been able to track the prevalence of malnutrition with the rise of obesity rates over the years?
It's a great question. And that research that was done by my colleagues, I was just an editorial writer. They really did some amazing work there by cataloging just how prevalent this is. In terms of worldwide work and what's going on behind this, I don't think we've actually come up with an answer just yet. But a really great question.
And I mean, I decided to put this to the test. And so I logged into MyFitnessPal and I was like, I'm skeptical. When I first read this, I'm like, I'm skeptical of what's being said right now. But I'm going to hold this up to the camera. And you can see, although I have far too much cholesterol and sodium and obviously fat, I want for you to zero in on what it says. I hope you can read this about that's a little bit blurry, but trust me, on there at one point it says potassium, and you're supposed to get roughly 3,500 milligrams of potassium per day. Um, I was only getting 150. 150, despite the fact I was taking in all of that fat, all of those calories, and just eating enough food to feed an army. Amazing. What are the most common nutrient deficiencies that have been identified among people who are struggling with their weight?
Yeah, so there. I don't know if there's a specific answer per se, but I would tell you that potassium is a major nutrient of concern, and the reason is that we know that when people have a potassium poor diet, they usually end up having things like high blood pressure and higher rates of heart disease. And where does potassium really come from? It comes from fruits, vegetables, all those things that we're supposed to eat in large quantities. Most people don't know this, but if you look up at the US RDA, the recommended daily allowances, you're supposed to have somewhere between 5 and 13 servings of fruit and vegetables per day or more. And most Americans aren't even getting that. So you can imagine that it's super easy to be low in potassium. Eating mushrooms every day, right? If you're able to get them in, vitamin D. Think about those dark green leafy vegetables that we all love. Not only are they loaded with protein, pound for pound, but they're loaded with all sorts of nutrients that a lot of people just don't get regularly. So I encourage people, even single people, to shop at the Costco or Sam's Club or one of these big warehouse stores and buy their produce in large quantities and try to challenge themselves to eat, 10 apples a week and 10 oranges a week and a plastic tub of spinach or whatever. And surprisingly, when people do this, the results are extraordinary. I mean, my favorite thing to do in a cardiology clinic is to take people off of their medication. And when their blood pressure was high to begin with, they make some changes in their diet, their exercise, and then I can take them off their pills. Think about how powerful that is. And a lot of times it's through nothing more than, swapping out spinach for ramen noodles or whatever it may be. So very powerful approach.
And how, I mean, this to me, like I said, it just blew my mind. But I know one of the things that you wrote about was the fact that a lot of people feel that way, including many of your colleagues in the medical profession. Why is it that there is this disconnect between the standard American diet and the lack of whole foods and obviously all of the nutrients that you need? Whereas, I mean, we're so focused on obviously if you're not eating enough and you're anorexic or you're bulimic, we know for a fact that you're not getting it. But why is it that the medical profession isn't viewing obesity in the same light?
Well, it's not only obesity, they're just not viewing lifestyle medicine as a tool of great power. I mean, think about this, right? So, a few years ago, a couple of our colleagues, we surveyed 1,000 cardiologists, and it turns out that even though we're asked about nutrition virtually every day, 90% of us know little to nothing about nutrition at all. And the reason for that is we're not trained with it, right? So, if you don't get trained on something, you don't know how to use it in your arsenal. And then even better is in this country, sadly, we're paid when people are sick, right? So one of my colleagues is bold enough to say to some of his most difficult patients, look, I don't care what you eat, right? If you eat poorly, I get paid more, which is a terrible thing to say, A, but B, surprisingly true. And unfortunately, which is sexier, right? Telling people to have peas and carrots, or putting in the new robotic assisted percutaneous valve. And the answer is usually, these fancy new medicines and procedures are really cool and very effective, and cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars versus making dietary changes. Think about it this way. You may have seen this meme on the internet, but I love sharing it, right? It's a doctor talking with his patient, and he says, "What would you like to do? Would you like me to strip out a vein from your leg, rip open your chest, disable you for a couple of months while we do bypass surgery, or do you want to eat just plants?" And the patient looks at him with wide eyes and says, "I think I might have to go with the surgery," right? Because people see the dietary changes as a major procedure. But the truth is, it's easier than ever to be plant-based, especially in the United States, but all over the world now, there are pockets of enlightened folks. And, to get back to your point, at the American College of Cardiology, 5, 6 years ago, there was no nutrition or lifestyle work group. I founded it, and actually now I've passed on the chair to my next colleague. And there's probably about 50 or 60 of us that are part of this group in the whole American College of Cardiology, which is, in the range of 45,000, 50,000 cardiologists. So you can imagine that we are just a tiny little minority. And the truth is, in this day and age where healthcare costs are outrageous, where people are becoming bigger and bigger despite interventions, where disease is higher than ever, where heart disease is starting to creep up again, shouldn't we arm ourselves with every possible tool in the arsenal? And the answer, of course, is yes. But people aren't necessarily doing it. And unfortunately, we're ending up in a place where, more and more medicine, more and more surgeries, more and more procedures that are potentially avoidable, we could have made some big changes, and we're not.
Have you actually taken the time to think about why it is that for so many of us that dietary change seems like the ultimate insurmountable obstacle, and why people would opt? You talked about that meme, but that is deadly serious. I mean, that is it. Why people would opt for such an invasive procedure versus dietary change? Have you guys taken a second, or I mean, longer than that, just to really contemplate why that is such a hurdle for people to clear?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is this. If you go back in time, right, you'd visit with your doctor. I'm sure when you were significantly overweight, your doctor said to you, "Hey, Chuck, you need to lose weight and exercise. See you next time." Right? And you'd come back and you had either gained weight, not lost weight, done none of it. Right? But what if your doctor had held your hand and said, "Hey, first, I want you to watch a bunch of these documentaries. I want you to get inspired. I want you to read about this. I want to plug you into Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, their vegan kickstart. I want to introduce you to a nutritionist. I want to introduce you to a support group. I'm actually going to walk with you on a weekend, which I do still walk with a doc. I'm going to do all this stuff to hold your hand through this process." All of a sudden it becomes a lot easier. We always talk about, rising on shoulders of giants, but, somebody has to help you get up there first, and then you can rise. And I think a lot of us, we pay lifestyle medicine lip service. But at the end of the day, when you say to your patient, "I want you to eat better, I want you to exercise," what does that really mean? And I think that's where, docs who have some specific training, docs who are motivated to incorporate these sort of waves of wellness in their healthcare institution can transform patients. And probably the most transformative thing that I do is something called intensive cardiac rehab. Now, I don't know, Chuck, did I ever talk to you about this before? I can't remember.
That sounds like a new concept to me.
Yeah. So as you may or may not know, if you have heart surgery, if you have bypass, if you have stents, valve surgery, if you have heart failure, if you have chronic angina, debilitating chest pain, you can qualify for cardiac rehab. And in some parts of the country, there is also intensive cardiac rehab, which is also covered by Medicare and all of the various insurances. And you may know that there are two providers for intensive cardiac rehab, names Ornish and Pritikin. And the Ornish program is what we started here in Denver. And it's a great program, right? So you come in, and rather than just, doing supervised exercise with a little bit of counseling, it is 4 hours twice a week for 9 weeks for 2 months. And in those 4 hours, you do an hour of exercise, an hour of plant-based nutrition. So we have a plant-based RD, registered dietitian, who teaches patients how to eat, gives them a meal, gives them tips on how to shop, how to eat out, etc. Recipes are shared frequently. We do an hour of group support. and we do an hour of stress relief mindfulness meditation. So it sounds like a spa, right? But it's covered by insurance. And you go through this program, and sadly, you have to be sort of sick to get in. But you go through this program, and after 9 weeks, most people who continue on this program, which is most of them, are incredibly better. I mean, I'm talking about blood pressure down, cholesterol way down, weight down, mental status and mental state way up, fitness levels way up. And it really is a kickstart where we hold the hands of patients, show them how to undo, 60 years or more of lifestyle poor choices. And all of a sudden you have people who have drastically and radically transformed for the better. This program, I'd love to give it to people who are in their 20s or their 30s or their 40s. And if you're lucky enough to live in places like California and actually in DC in some places, you can get plant-based foods in your schools, in your prisons, believe it or not, in your hospitals. And in other places like Colorado, I've had to fight very hard to get a plant-based option, instituted on the menu. And of course, it still exists side by side with bacon, which of course, as we know, is as cancer-causing as cigarettes. But we can't remove it from the hospital menu because it's considered a profit center, which is sad.
You talk about this rehab, and obviously the approach there is far different than probably any of the gimmick diets that these patients have tried previously, whether it's Jenny Craig or Weight Watchers or keto, whatever the case may be. The long-term success rate for those gimmicky diets, I would imagine, is not very high. What have you noticed as far as those patients who successfully complete the rehab process with you? Because this is far different than just giving them a diet on a sheet of paper. You're really unveiling a whole new lifestyle.
Right. And I try to stay away from the word diet. And the reason is that people hear the word diet and they say, oh, well, I can do that for a few weeks or a few months or whatever. I want people to see this as a lifestyle. It's kind of like, just like I'm not eating my keyboard and the pieces of paper around me, when a hamburger crosses my desk, it's not food to me. I don't see it as food. I don't want to eat it. And I want patients to get into that mode, that habit, if you will. And people will say to me, well, doc, do you do this? And I tell them my own story, right? I think I shared with you on the first time, I did this myself and dropped 30 pounds and redid my life insurance physical and got a rebate check in the mail. And patients are always like, oh, I guess it really does work. And, and I would tell you that the results are extraordinary. I myself this morning got up early, did a Peloton bike and, eat a plant-based breakfast. And here I am, right? And I want people to do the same thing and just make it part of their lifestyle as opposed to a diet. Now, if you look at many of the commercially available diet programs, Jenny Craig, Nutrisystem, Weight Watchers, they all work in unique ways, but by and large, they're basically restricting portion sizes, except for fruits and vegetables, which should be a hint that those are the good things, right? So, if you're loading up on fruits and vegetables, many times you get 0 points or they don't count against your food total for the day or whatever it may be. So I tell people load up on these things, right? So when you have a need for a sweet, go slice up a Honeycrisp apple or eat some carrots or whatever it may be. But I think that they work to help people lose weight. But, as soon as that portion control goes away, there's a problem. And then many of those dietary programs also have meals. And the way those meals work is they're actually very small portions of less than good food, processed stuff, which I don't want people to eat either. When it comes to keto, I will tell you for sure, people on a keto diet do lose weight. And I think a lot of reason that they lose weight is they cut out all the junk, right? The garbage carbs, or what I affectionately call garbage, right? There's a lot of that in our diets. Even plant-based diets can be loaded with that stuff. And when you get rid of that, your weight goes down. And then when you're on a ketogenic diet, it may help you lose weight. Although I've certainly had patients who've not only lost weight, but have had trouble regulating their diabetes or have had worsening angina, incredibly high cholesterol. They don't feel great. Their gut health hasn't been good. Every so often I run into a person who can do keto for the long term and feels good, looks good, and their numbers are good. But I don't think that we are wired to eat that way. In fact, if you go back in time, more and more records are suggesting that we lived predominantly on a grain and fruit and vegetable gatherer as opposed to hunter type of diet. And I suspect that's probably true. And then in terms of intermittent fasting, which is another sort of hot topic, I think that's probably physiologic, right? If you look back in time, you may not have, when you were crossing through a desert, right, there weren't berries and fruits and tubers and all these things around. So you probably didn't eat for a day or so. And then you would find stuff and you would, store up again. And I think that that may be helpful. So for my patients who are really struggling with weight loss, I put them on a plant-based, whole food, low-fat diet. And then I also will start to restrict the time that they eat, sometimes between, say, 11 a.m. and 5 p.m., and tell them that they can have water or unsweetened tea, unsweetened coffee throughout the day. And then when they want to eat, just to eat between 11 and 5, and then not to gorge themselves. But by and large, most of the gimmicky diets don't work in the long term. None of the diets that are out there are any better at calorie restriction. But there are significant signals in the plant-based world that people who follow that diet seem to maintain their slimness longer, especially if they maintain on that diet. So I'm a big fan, as you can tell.
Absolutely. So how long have you been running this rehab program?
We started about, say, 3 or 4 years ago, and COVID has given us our own challenges and social distancing and all this other stuff. But we've probably put through in the range of about 500 people at this point.
Wow.
And the results are truly incredible. I mean, people go back to their doc and, I always tell people intensive cardiac rehab for all intents and purposes is a black box, right? You give us your very challenged, difficult patients in one side, and then they come through and out comes shiny diamonds. And the truth is, especially for the primary care doctors, they love that their A1C, their diabetes are down, their CRP, their measure of inflammation is down, their blood pressure is down, they're in a better mood, they're exercising regularly. I mean, these are amazing things that you can't get from pills.
And I would imagine, along with educating the patients, you were just talking about it. It sounds like you're educating the physicians as well. So that's a bonus.
Yeah, there's a lot of naysayers out there who'll say, oh, that won't work, or I've tried that, or I've been in practice for 50 years and this won't work. The truth is, if you're not trained in this way, you can't do it well. It's hard to champion something that you're not knowledgeable in, right? Imagine that you went to a cardiologist who wasn't trained in cardiology. I mean, that would be weird, right? So same thing, one of the tools in our arsenal should be this. And so, yes, when I send a patient back to a doctor, particularly a naysayer, and they look at their patient and they're like, oh my God, how did you drop 25 pounds? And how is your blood pressure normal? And the answer is, well, I've been eating fruits and vegetables, exercising, working on stress, and connecting with others. They all look at it, like, oh, that's weird. How does that work? And the truth is, there's some real, it's almost magical. A lot of people would tell you that science was magic until we really understood what was behind it. And I think we're starting to understand what's behind this approach.
Have you been able to keep up with some of your first patients who went through this 3-4 years ago? How are they doing today?
Yeah, the truth is, when you get somebody who's truly committed to this, and that's not an everyday thing, they stick with their clinicians, their providers. And so, for the people who have stuck with it, it is truly extraordinary. To this day, many of them have maintained their weight, their blood pressure's down, they're off their pills, they feel great. One of the more common things that I get, and you'll get a kick out of this, is the patients come back and say, look, my friends are all telling me that I don't look like I'm aging anymore. And there must be something magical here. And there's been some data published that shows that aging may slow down when you follow this sort of anti-inflammatory plant-based diet. But when you're 60 or 70 and everyone around you is looking like they're 80 or 90 and you're not aging as well, people are surprised. I mean, think about this, right? People come to me and say, oh my God, you look like a little kid, doc. How long have you been in practice? And I tell them, well, I've been, in medicine, I graduated from medical school in 2003, right? So here we are in 2021. So I've been in practice for a long time, and I have 4 kids, and people are like, wow, how do you have, I can't imagine, how does life like that? And I think, lifestyle says a lot. Granted, there's genes and all these things that we can't control, but, it's pretty amazing when you see people who were so less vibrant become vibrant again, even in their later ages.
Yeah, it's fun. I was watching as we tape this. We're in the middle of the NFL playoffs and watching Tom Brady play this past weekend, and he's 42 years old. They did a side-by-side photo comparison of him versus a old quarterback by the name of George Blanda. Now, this photo was taken, some 30 plus years ago. Both of them at 42 years of age. Tom Brady looked like he was about 30. George Blanda looked like he was about 55, 60 years old. I mean, could have pulled off being a brother to the Marlboro Man back in the day. It was just unbelievable. And then you think about, well, how clean Brady's diet is. He's not 100% plant-based, but he is awfully close. And you see not only the results on the field and how he's just kind of defying time there, but certainly in the looks category as well. It's just remarkable.
Well, you'll get a kick out of this. You may know this, but a lot of times after the NFL players retire, they actually suffer significant heart disease. I had the privilege a couple of years ago of reading many of the echoes of retired NFL players. Echoes are the ultrasounds of their hearts. And there's a lot of disease in relatively young people in their 50s and even 60s. And so I would tell you that, what happens is when you're a football player and you're eating, 3 dozen eggs a day and 5 chicken breasts every meal, and and you're exercising hard and lifting 1,000 pounds, it's probably relatively easy to stay in decently good shape. But if you maintain that lifestyle and you're not exercising as hard as you were, you can imagine things go downhill very rapidly. And I've certainly seen that in my retired pro athletes. For the ones that do make these changes where they maintain their physical activity, they eat better, they eat cleaner, they live cleaner, they always do better. But the ones who kind of continue on the track are doing worse. Fortunately, with the movie Game Changers and a number of other people like Tom Brady and others, people are now starting to say, wow, how is that guy doing so well? He's 42, right? He's considered geriatric in the NFL, and yet he's still playing. And so the answer to these questions, I think, are really in how people live and how they train. And maybe you don't need to be 500 pounds to be the best football player. And maybe you don't need to eat 3 dozen eggs a day. So.
And as we wrap up, I want to go back to the original topic, and that's obesity and malnutrition. I'm curious, in the patients who you've worked with, what are some of the more common nutrient deficiencies that you've been able to identify?
So, I check vitamin D pretty routinely, and that's actually just because people are inside and sedentary, extremely low very commonly. We know that vitamin D, an important nutrient that has all sorts of effects on muscles and bones, but also appears to have some protection against COVID susceptibility, which is kind of interesting. So people who have lower vitamin D levels might be more susceptible. So I think that one's an important one. B12 in some folks, if they're not taking supplements, can be quite low, especially if they're not eating animal products. And those that are eating animal products, typically it's not very low, but it's also not very high. I've seen calcium deficiencies, magnesium deficiencies, certainly potassium deficiency. I don't routinely check micronutrients. There's hundreds of them that we can check unless there's a specific issue. Typically more naturopathic doctors are following that type of a trend. But by and large, it's amazing to see the transition from somebody who's eating poorly to somebody who's eating well. They transition very quickly to a very healthful state.
Can we quantify that? Put a length on it.
How quick?
Everybody always wants to know how quickly you can lose weight, but let's talk about getting those calcium levels up, those vitamin D levels up, the potassium levels up once they transition to eating a more healthy diet.
Yeah, we're talking about weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. I've seen people lose weight, improve their energy level. They start to get that life glow, if that makes sense. When somebody looks freshly showered and they're excited to be alive, that comes back to people. So I would say that I see it in literally, it starts happening in a couple of weeks. And usually if I see them back in a month, the results are there. And again, they haven't gone from 500 pounds to 150 in a month. But some people have lost 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 pounds in a month. It's amazing. I take care of people who drink literally 12 cans of soda a day. When you cut that out, the amount of calories that are in that literally just disappear. And so people drop weight so rapidly if they are a soda addict.
And last question, I want to leave people feeling inspired here because no matter how much science we talk about, no matter how many numbers we throw at them, if they don't hear of a specific example, they just don't believe it themselves. What patient in all of your years preaching the gospel, so to speak, of a plant-based diet, which patient's transformation has really stood out to you? Talk to me about the health change there.
Yeah, so I took care of a guy. I actually presented him at the Physicians Committee conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. But he was a guy in his 40s who had had a car crash as a result of an arrhythmia from heart failure. And he was in his 40s, massively obese, untreated sleep apnea, untreated hypertension, untreated dyslipidemia, so high cholesterol. His heart was weak. Um, he came to see me, and I immediately changed so many of his lifestyles habits. And literally within 3 months, he was markedly better, dropped a ton of weight. And then within 6 months, his heart failure was gone. His blood pressure was normal. His cholesterol was normal. His diabetes was in remission. His sleep apnea was treated, which he was doing with a mask at night. And as his weight has gone down, we're planning on rechecking his sleep apnea to see if it's gone away. But by and large, you take somebody like that who literally has a major car wreck as a result of a heart condition, and he's in his 40s, and you transition him back to normalcy. Not only have you given him normal longevity, right? He can live a normal lifespan now, but you've given him his quality of life back. Imagine being in your 40s and feeling like crap. That would be terrible. And here he is back to normal. So that's my greatest transition, I think.
Outstanding. And, people think it can't be me. I could never possibly do that. But I'm guessing this guy isn't Superman. He's a gentleman who had a wake up call and implemented changes, and we see the results.
Yeah, I always tell people there's two ways to learn, right? Pleasure and pain. Some people are excited by doing well and feeling good, and some people need to nearly die before they make these changes. And I hope that for everyone listening, that you don't wait until you nearly die.
Amen to that, my friend. Amen to that. Dr. Andrew Freeman, give him a follow on Twitter at HeartCureDoc. Check out his website, vegancardiologist.com. Congratulations on getting that domain. That is just fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you feel like you've raised your health IQ by a couple of points, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and leave a nice comment below. And to hear the entire interview, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your shows from and subscribe to The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. And please leave a 5-star rating.